think if you look back at Dashiell Hammett, he's a wonderful example of that. I mean, he only had a very small body of published work, and then the movies and everything else, well, there were other things that intervened as well. But I call it the business of being a writer, as opposed to being a writer. But it's absolutely true that it does swamp and trying to find your way among all those things. But also the baggage that every book accumulates. I mean, you start out with 2 characters, and then on we go. So what has been, because we're not in Scotland anymore, in the Fiery Cross, we are in North Carolina, we are on the Fraser homestead. How did your characters move from Scotland across to America, which is where they're presently situated?
Well, I just followed the tide of history, which is that following Culloden in 1745, essentially the clan system in the Highlands was completely smashed. And the Highlands were desolated by the Duke of Cumberland's army. There was no more economy, minimal as that had been to start with. A great many of the men were dead. A good many more of them were transported as war criminals and sent to the colonies or to the Indies as essentially slave labor. Many of the women were driven out to starve, if not bayoneted on the spot. It was a terrible place. And a lot of people said to me after when we got into the 3rd book, they said, "Oh, but I really like Scotland. I wanted you to write some more about Scotland." And I said, "Look, it's not the Scotland that you liked after 1745. They passed a law forbidding people from wearing the kilt, for instance, so no more men in kilts, no more bagpipes. It was a weapon of war and was thus outlawed." I said, it wasn't the Scotland that you fell in love with in the first 2 books, because the tragedy of the 45 was that died on that day.
It absolutely did. I've always thought that the Stuart monarchs were not only, well, they were unlucky. They had bad judgment. Yeah, they were. They had really bad judgment, and they didn't have any gift for picking subordinates.
None.
In fact, if you look at Culloden, if you go and take the tour of the battlefield, which I have done, and which you probably have done as well, it's very clear that the generalship on the Scots side was just appalling.
Oh, yeah.
Picked the wrong ground, fought the wrong way, all of those things. So I've always thought, while it was really hard on the Scots who supported him, it was really good luck in general. Well, and interestingly enough, his father, James, the Old Pretender, who had come over in 1715 to chance his hand and then been defeated, and then Charlie, known as the Young Pretender, comes back in 1745. Charlie and his brother, Henry, both chose not to marry and not to reproduce. So there would be no more Stuart heirs. So that the tragedy of 1745 was it.
That's right.
And I've always thought I had to admire that one thing they did. Henry became a priest, if I recall.
That's right. And became the Bishop of York.
Right. And Charlie, I think, actually married, didn't he? But he was childless.
Well, he did, yeah. Now, there is a certain amount of evidence that he did, in fact, have children, but not by his legitimate wife.
Children.
And therefore they were not heirs.
Right, which is where the controversy started way back with James II and the worming pan baby. Anyway,
Exactly.
well, that's off our point. So anyway, so it isn't, staying in Scotland is probably not going to be
so it's not
happy.
Not happy. And so I said, what happened to the Highlanders who survived Culloden? What happened to them? Some of them were transported, as I said. Some of them existed in this perilous state, but a lot of them emigrated on purpose. Many of them had gone in 1730s to North Carolina and were settled there. And so after the 45, a great many more went there too, because there they could find, if not direct kin, at least friends, people with a common background and a common language, because of course they were speaking Gaelic. And so this is where a lot of them went. And so I said, well, isn't that interesting? So I began looking at North Carolina, and sure enough, this is where one main stream of the Culloden survivors went. Another stream went to Canada, to Mackenzie, to Prince Edward Island. The Clan Mackenzie mostly went there, and we'll run into them in a future book.
Ah, good.
But here we're dealing with the ones who went to North Carolina, and there's a lot of documentation as to what happened to them after they went there. And so I said, well, this is where we should go. And as I looked further and further into North Carolina, I realized that this was one of the hotbeds of the pre-Revolutionary War era. In fact, there is a document called the Mecklenburg Declaration, which was published in 1775, a year earlier than the Declaration of Independence, but which espouses essentially the same principles.
Well, it's no surprise, is it? The other thing I think that probably made North Carolina appealing was the geography. I mean, it was a place in the New World that was not that dissimilar
No, it was
from
very
Scotland
much like the
and
Scottish
old
Highlands, yeah.
You
It
bet.
had remote mountains, and at the same time, the hunting was a lot better.
Right, but it was the Highlander, the
Yeah,
mountain thing. Sharon McCrum has written, as you know,
Oh, yeah.
a lot about this same thing. In her most recent book, The Songcatcher, involves a boy who was taken from Islay.
Yes.
And brought over and to New Jersey, but eventually
walked
down to North Carolina. And it isn't surprising, in fact, that so much of the pre-revolutionary fever grew there. So you've called the new book The Fiery Cross. Why?
Well, it actually comes from an ancient Highland custom. Way back in the mists of antiquity, and no one knows where it started, but it was a well-entrenched custom in the Highlands. A clan chieftain who was preparing for a war of some kind would tie 2 sticks of wood together and set them on fire. The fire was then put out, usually with blood, sheep's blood, or with water if he didn't have a handy sheep. And the remnants were still called the Fiery Cross, and 2 clansmen would then be deputed to carry this cross through the glens and the corries as a signal to the men of the clan to gather their weapons and, you know, come to the castle or the gathering place prepared for battle. And so that's what it is. It's a signal of oncoming war.
It's a wonderful, wonderful chapter in the book.
Through the agency of the daughter's boyfriend, who is connected to the story by other strands that I won't go into. He is a young historian who is fascinated by the story and begins delving into it at first to see if it's true, which he quickly discovers it is, but then he begins to discover evidence indicating that Jamie Fraser did not die at Culloden, which is, of course, a terrible shock to Claire. And they succeed in tracking him gradually through these brief appearances through history, and they finally locate a man who they think is Jamie Fraser in Edinburgh in 1766, which is the proper synchrony for Claire. If she were to go back here, that's where she'd land, is Edinburgh in 1766, if our theories of time travel hold.
Well, actually, one of the questions I was going to ask you is if she aged 20 years in the 20th century, did she similarly age, or if she goes back, is she going to be younger? But if she's pregnant coming forward, I guess she has to be older going backwards, or you've kind of lost it, haven't you?
Yeah, no, according to the Gabaldon theory of time travel, you continue along your own lifeline no matter which time period you're in, so and therefore you do age normally wherever you are.
Right, so you're going to send her back, not a young woman, but in fact a middle-aged woman. And a mother, and then Jamie is going to have actually missed the bringing up his daughter. And he hasn't, in the interval, presumably married or acquired, or have you done that to him? You don't want to tell.
I don't want
We've got to leave some stuff. All right, so anyway.
Too many details there.
Too much of the mystery writer in us, both of us here, to do all that. So somehow, without going into it all, she does go back. And what happens to the child?
Well, the child is now a young adult, which is the only reason that Claire could bring herself to leave. In fact, the daughter forces her to leave, just as Jamie forced her to go. And the daughter says, you know, he gave you to me, I have to give you back to him.
Right. But doesn't the daughter eventually turn up?
Yes, she does, because she discovers something in her own researches that indicates to her, you know, a significant danger to her parents, you know, sometime in their future, in the later 1770s. And, you know, she has been feeling this strong pull toward this unknown man who was her actual father. You know, he did miss seeing her, and she missed seeing him. And now that she's learned he exists, she feels this strong, you know, urge to find him, and still more that both he and her beloved mother stand in this danger. She feels that she needs to get to them while there is still time, and so the danger might be averted. This is sort of a continuing question through all the books, is if you know something is going to happen, can you change it?
Right.
And if you can, or if you can't, why not, and what happens?
Well, actually, it's sort of the central moral question, don't you think, of all time travel?
That's exactly right.
And it's interesting the way that you have chosen to handle it, you know, because, I mean, other writers have tried it, and there are different kinds of theories.
Everybody has their own take on it.
I've always been really offended by people, you know, who, well, one of my favorite books along these lines is a book by Susanna Kersley called, what is it called? The Something Horses.
The Shadowy Horses.
Thank you. I couldn't remember. Where in 20th century, what is it, Lower Scotland, Northern England, somewhere right up there in the border country. They go to visit the site of an old Roman legion camp, and there is a ghost from the past that comes in, and it is a Roman centurion. Now, in almost all time travel books, you're off the hook because you're in Scotland in the 18th century, and this is okay. Somehow, magically, this Roman centurion can speak,
talk to them, yes.
you know, and they can understand it. But in Susanna's book, the only person who can talk to this ghost of the Roman soldier is this little kid who's studying Latin, because the soldier.
That's very sensible.
It is, you know, and I think that that is one of the things that puts people off time travel books sometimes, is that they think there are going to be these conventions or devices, you know, that are just
which are silly. Yeah.
And you know, you haven't got such a huge time period, and you're in people who are relatively in the language, so they can probably overcome it.